Hello, in this presentation I'm going to discuss three theories: postcolonialism, narratology, and structuralism. Let's begin. Let's begin with postcolonialism. What is it? Postcolonialism is the critical study of the political, cultural, and psychological effects of colonial rule and imperialism, and how these continue to shape identity, power, and resistance in formerly colonized societies. It challenges Eurocentric worldviews, questions the power structures of empire, and explores how colonial domination continues to influence contemporary life, especially through language, education, literature, and representation. Let's talk about its representatives. First of all, we have Edward Said. His influences are Foucault and his concept of discourse, and also Marxism and humanism. The first concept I'll mention is Orientalism. Orientalism is a system of representation, and it occupies three overlapping domains. First, the 4,000-year history and cultural relations between Europe and Asia. Second, the scientific discipline producing specialists in Oriental languages and culture from the early 19th century. And third, the long-term images, stereotypes, and general ideology about the Orient as the other, constructed by generations of Western scholars. Shortly, Orientalism is the Western tradition of how the Orient or the other is represented by Western cultures. Following, Said's work draws to some extent on Foucault's analysis of discourse as power, which Said extends to explain the function of cultural representations in the constructions and maintenance of the First Third World relation. Said builds on Michel Foucault's concept of discourse, which refers to the system of thought, language, and practices that define what is true or acceptable in a given time. According to Foucault, discourse produces knowledge, and knowledge is directly connected to power. Said applies this to Orientalism. Orientalist discourse defined what could be said, taught, or believed about the Orient. This controlled the image of the East and made Western dominance seem logical or necessary. Secondly, Spivak, whose influences are feminism and Marxism, introduced the concept of the subaltern, which reflects her belief that truly oppressed voices cannot be authentically represented within dominant discourse. When Western intellectuals try to give voice to the subaltern, they often reproduce the very structures of domination they intend to critique. And finally, Baba's influences were Derrida, psychoanalysis, and Foucault. His main concepts were mimicry and hybridity, in which he explains that there is a point in which the oppressed culture starts to mimic and copy the colonizer, creating mixed cultures. Colonized cultures become almost the same, but not quite. How can postcolonialism be applied to literary works? In order to apply postcolonialism to a literary work, we have to take into account how colonialism is represented. It is fundamental to analyze how words are chosen to describe colonized cultures and how these cultures are represented by the Western world. Let's continue with narratology. What is it? It is the study of how narrative work, their structure, elements, and the way stories are told. Its concern is not with what the story says, that is to say its content, but how it says it. It means its form. Its representatives are Aristotle, who identifies character and action as essential elements in a story, and he says that character must be revealed through action, which is to say through aspects of the plot. He identified three key elements, being the first one, hemartia, which means sin or fault. Second, the agnagoris, meaning recognition or realization, being the moment of the narrative when the truth is recognized by the protagonist. And third, peripeteia, meaning the turnaround or a reversal of fortune, which is fall from high to low states, as the hero falls from great states. Secondly, there is Vladimir Prop, who was a Russian formalist who worked on Russian folktales, identifying recurrent structures and situations in such tales. On his work, The Morphology of the Folktales, he wrote that he found 31 recurrent functions that were used to construct such tales. Not every function are on the tales, but all are constructed by selecting items from it, being the hero, the villain, the donor, the dispatcher, just to name a few. Finally, Gerard Donnet introduces the concept of focalization, which is the viewpoint or perspective from which the story is told. Then the concept of narrator, which can be homodiegetic, who may be a character inside the story, or heterodiegetic, who is not a character in the story. Then the concept of how time is handled in a story in which narrative often contains references back or forward so that the order of the telling does not correspond to the order of the happening. And finally, the questions of how the story is packaged, meaning that sometimes stories are not always presented straight. Often, writers make use of frame narratives, which are embedded narratives, such as the case of the Canterbury Tales. How can narratology be applied to literary works? In order to do an analysis based on narratology, we have to mark a difference between story and plot, analyze how time is presented, who is the narrator, and from which point of view the story is told. Finally, let's talk about structuralism. It is a theoretical approach that views language, literature, and culture as a system of signs governed by structures and relationships rather than individual meaning. It began in France in the 50s, and it is first seen in the work of the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and the literary critic Roland Barthes. Its essence is the belief that things cannot be understood in isolation, they have to be seen in the context of the larger structures they are part of. Let's talk about its representatives. Although structuralism proper began in the 50s, it has its roots in the thinking of Ferdinand Saussure, who concentrated on the patterns and functions of language in use today, with the emphasis of how meaning are maintained and established and on the functions of grammatical structures. Firstly, he emphasized that the meaning we give to words are purely arbitrary. Secondly, for him, meaning of words are relational, which means that no word can be defined in isolation from other words. And thirdly, for Saussure, language constitutes our world. It doesn't just record it or label it. Meaning is always attributed to the object or idea by the human mind and constructed by, expressed through language. Finally, another distinction that Saussure made was the distinction between parole and langue, to signify language as a system on the one hand and any given utterance in that language on the other. Another important name to mention is Claude Lévi-Strauss, who applied the structuralist outlook to the interpretation of myth. He suggested that the individual tale from a cycle of myth did not have a separate and inherent meaning, but could only be understood by considering its position in the whole cycle and the similarities and differences of that tale and others in sequence. In this method, the story and the cycle are reconstituted in terms of basic oppositions. Finally, another person worth mentioning is Roland Barthes, who applied the structuralist method to the general field of modern culture. This looked at a host of items which had never before been subjected to intellectual analysis. Each of these items he placed within a wider structure of values, beliefs, and symbols are the key to understanding it. How can we apply structuralism? What structuralist critics do is analyze the prose narratives relating the text to some larger containing structure. They interpret literature in terms of a range of underlying parallels with the structure of language as described by modern linguistics. They apply the concept of systemic patterning and structuring to the whole field of Western culture, from ancient Greek myths to brands of soap powder.